Jake ran through the dark alley, his breath heavy, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of sirens echoed behind him, getting closer with every second. He pushed forward, his legs burning, his mind racing. The streets were empty, the night cold, but the fear inside him was hotter than fire. He didn't know why they were chasing him. He hadn't done anything wrong. At least, not that he knew of. But the police weren't slowing down. They wanted him. And they were getting closer. A sharp turn. A dead end. Jake's eyes darted around for an escape, but there was none. His hands trembled. He turned back just in time to see the shadows moving in. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the brick walls, blinding him for a second. Tires screeched. Doors slammed. Heavy boots hit the ground. Guns clicked. Hands up. Now. A voice roared. Jake froze. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't move. He slowly lifted his hands, his chest rising and falling with fast, shaky breaths. There were at least 10 officers surrounding him, their weapons aimed directly at his head. On your knees. Another voice ordered. Jake hesitated, his muscles locked. His instincts told him this was wrong. He didn't understand why this was happening. But before he could react, strong hands grabbed him from behind. A hard force slammed him to the ground. His face hit the cold pavement. Pain shot through his jaw. His hands were twisted behind his back, metal cuffs snapping tightly around his wrists. Stay down, a cop growled. Jake groaned, his head spinning. His heart pounded so loudly that he could barely hear the voices around him. He felt the weight of a knee pressing against his back, keeping him pinned. His breathing was short and sharp. One officer reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The man flipped it open, looked at the ID inside, and then everything changed. The grip on Jake's arms loosened slightly. A strange silence filled the air. The officer holding his wallet stiffened, his hands shaking just a little. His eyes widened as if he had seen a ghost. He turned to the others, his face pale. "Oh no," he whispered. "This is his son." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances. Their fingers twitched over their triggers. The tension in the air shifted from aggression to fear. A few of them took a step back. One officer cleared his throat. "We need to get him out of here." His voice was quieter now, almost nervous. Jake felt his heartbeat slow for a second. He noticed the way their faces had changed. These men had been ready to take him down. But now, something was different. They weren't just looking at him. They were looking at who he was. "Take him to the station," the first officer ordered, his voice firm but shaky. 2 men grabbed Jake's arms and lifted him up. He winced, his wrists aching against the tight cuffs. He wanted to ask what was going on, but something in their eyes told him not to. There was something dangerous in their expressions, something he didn't understand. As they walked him toward the police car, Jake caught one last glimpse of the alley. The darkness seemed deeper than before. The city felt quieter. He had been afraid when he was running, but now something else crawled into his chest, something heavier. The doors of the police car slammed shut. The engine roared to life. The car pulled away from the alley, leaving the flashing lights behind. Jake sat in the back seat, staring at his reflection in the window. His mind raced with questions, but one thought echoed the loudest. Who do they think my father is? Jake sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The air smelled of stale coffee and sweat. A single flickering bulb buzzed above him, casting long shadows on the walls. His heart was still racing from the chase, but now a different kind of fear settled inside him. Something was wrong. The way the officers had reacted to his name, it didn't make sense. Outside the room, muffled voices whispered urgently. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the tension in their tones. He shifted in his chair, trying to listen more closely. Footsteps echoed down the hall, getting louder. Then the door creaked open, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. He wasn't dressed like a regular cop. His presence alone made the air feel heavier. The man pulled out a chair and sat across from Jake, resting a thick folder on the table. He stared at him for a long moment, his sharp eyes scanning his face. Then he took a deep breath. "Who is your father?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. Jake blinked. The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He frowned, confusion clouding his face. "What?" The man leaned forward slightly. "Your father. Tell me his name." Jake hesitated. This was insane. Why were they asking about his dad? His father had died years ago, or at least, that's what he had always believed. He barely had any memories of him. Just old photos and stories his mother used to tell before she passed away. "He's dead," Jake muttered. "He died when I was a kid." The man let out a slow sigh, tapping his fingers on the table. "That's what they told you," he said. Then he pushed the folder forward and flipped it open. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Inside the file were pictures, grainy, black and white images of a man in military gear, holding a rifle, standing in the middle of what looked like a battlefield. His face was covered in dirt and sweat, but his eyes, they were the same as Jake's. "This is your father," the man said, pointing at the photo. "Daniel Cross, Delta Force operative. A legend. A ghost." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "and very much alive." Jake felt his stomach twist. His mind spun. This had to be a mistake. His father was dead. He had to be. But the man in the pictures, there was no denying it. His voice came out hoarse. "That's not possible." The man leaned back in his chair, watching Jake's reaction. "Your father was one of the most dangerous men to ever serve in the military. He completed missions no one else could. Missions that don't exist on paper." He closed the folder and folded his hands. Then, one day, he disappeared. No trace. No body. Just gone. Jake swallowed hard. His hands clenched into fists behind his back. None of this made sense, yet deep down, something in his gut told him it was true. The man continued, his voice turning serious. "Listen to me, Jake. If your father finds out about your arrest, people will die." A chill ran down Jake's spine. The air in the room felt thinner. "Why?" he whispered. Before the man could answer, the lights flickered. Then, without warning, the entire station went dark. A tense silence filled the room. The air conditioner hummed to a stop. Even the distant voices from outside had vanished. Then, in the pitch-black room, a deep, steady voice echoed through the walls. "Let the boy go." Silence filled the room like a thick fog. Jake's breath hitched. The voice had come from somewhere deep in the station, but it was calm, steady, too controlled to be a simple threat. It was a warning, a promise. The detective stiffened in his chair, his fingers twitching toward his holster. Outside, urgent whispers turned into panicked shouts. Footsteps pounded against the floor. Someone was barking orders, but it was clear. Nobody knew what was happening. Jake swallowed hard. His skin prickled with cold fear. He couldn't see the man across from him anymore, only the vague outline of his figure in the dark. Then the emergency lights flickered on. A dull red glow bathed the room, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The detective shot up from his chair, grabbed the folder, and muttered a curse under his breath. "He's here," the man growled. "We need to move the kid now." The door burst open, and two officers rushed inside, their faces pale. "Sir, the security system is down. Cameras are fried. Phones are dead." One of them wiped his forehead, his hand trembling. "It's like a blackout, but only in the station." The detective's jaw clenched. He turned to Jake, eyes burning with something between anger and fear. "Listen to me, kid. You have no idea what kind of man your father is." Jake's throat felt dry. He forced himself to speak. "I don't even know him." The detective let out a bitter laugh. "Then let me teach you something." He leaned down, his voice lower now. "Your father isn't just a soldier. He's a ghost. Delta Force doesn't train men like him. They create them. He's the kind of man who can wipe out an entire unit without making a sound. The kind of man who disappears, only to reappear when you least expect him. The officer at the door cut in, his voice shaky. "Sir, officers are going missing." Jake's blood ran cold. "What do you mean missing?" The detective snapped. The officer swallowed hard. "We lost contact with the front entrance team. 2 guys from the holding cells are just gone. No signs of struggle. Nothing on the cameras. Because the cameras aren't working." He wiped his face again, his breathing uneven. "It's like he's picking us off one by one." Jake's pulse pounded against his skull. He didn't know whether to feel terrified or relieved. If his father was here, did that mean he was coming to save him? Or did it mean something much worse? A loud crash echoed from the hallway. A metal door slammed against the wall, followed by a strangled yell. Then silence. The detective didn't hesitate. He grabbed Jake by the arm, yanked him to his feet, and pushed him toward the back exit. "Move. Now." The officers flanked them, their hands tight on their weapons, eyes darting in every direction. Every shadow felt like it was watching them. Every step echoed too loudly. They reached a side hallway. The detective pulled out his radio. "All units, secure the suspect transport. We're getting the kid out." A sharp click rang out. The officer to Jake's right stiffened, his body frozen mid-step. His gun slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. A thin line of red trailed down from his neck. Then, without a sound, he collapsed. Jake's stomach lurched. His breath came out in short gasps. The detective spun around, gun raised. The remaining officer did the same, their backs now pressed against each other. The hallway stretched out before them, empty. Too empty. Then a whisper, so close it sent chills down Jake's spine. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." The detective's face turned white. He grabbed Jake's arm tighter and pulled him forward. "Run." Jake barely had time to think. His legs moved on their own. He sprinted down the hallway, his heart slamming against his ribs. Behind him, he heard the sharp pop of a silenced gunshot. Then another. Then nothing. Jake skidded to a stop at a side exit, gasping for air. He turned around, expecting to see the detective behind him. But the hallway was empty. Everyone was gone. His hands trembled as he reached for the door handle. But before he could move, a firm hand clamped down on his shoulder. Jake spun around, his body locking up in fear. A man stood before him, dressed in all black, his face hidden in the dim red light. Jake barely had time to react before the man's voice cut through the silence. "It's time to go, son." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He stared up at the man before him, his mind refusing to accept what he already knew. The voice, the presence, the way the entire police station had crumbled into silence around him. His father. Daniel Cross stood tall, his face partially hidden by the shadows. His eyes were cold, sharp, scanning Jake as if assessing whether he was hurt. He was dressed in black, his movements calculated, effortless. He didn't look like a man who had just walked through a heavily guarded police station. He looked like a ghost who had never been there at all. Jake's legs felt weak. He wanted to say something, ask something, anything, but his words stuck in his throat. Daniel's grip on his shoulder tightened. "We need to move." His voice was low, steady. "Now." Jake shook his head, snapping back to reality. "Wait, what just happened?" "The cops." "They're alive," Daniel cut in. "Most of them." He glanced over his shoulder, his jaw tightening. "But more will come, and not just them." Jake swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "Who are you?" The words felt foreign, even though they had been building inside him since the interrogation room. Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "That's a long story, kid. One we don't have time for right now." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a knife, and swiftly cut the zip tie still holding Jake's wrists together. "We need to leave before the real problem arrives." Jake rubbed his sore wrists, his mind still spinning. The real problem. What does that even mean? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the exit, his movements silent. Without thinking, Jake followed. The night air hit him like a shock as they stepped outside. The world beyond the police station felt too normal. Streetlights, empty roads, the distant hum of the city. But something felt wrong. The hair on the back of Jake's neck stood up. Daniel moved quickly, leading him toward a black SUV parked just down the alley. Jake hesitated for half a second before climbing in. The moment his door shut, Daniel started the engine and pulled away. Jake stared out the window, watching the police station shrink behind them. He still didn't understand what had just happened. All he knew was that the cops had been terrified of his father. And now, for the first time, he wondered if maybe they had a reason to be. The silence in the car was heavy. Jake couldn't take it anymore. "Are you really my father?" Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. "Yes." Jake exhaled sharply. He had prepared himself for a lie, a dismissal, anything but the truth. "You were supposed to be dead," Jake muttered. "They told me you died years ago." Daniel let out a breath, his eyes fixed on the road. That was the plan. Jake turned to face him, anger bubbling inside him. "The plan." His voice rose. "You let me think you were dead. For what? Why?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "To keep you safe." Jake let out a short, bitter laugh. "Yeah. And how's that working out?" Daniel didn't react. He drove in silence for a long moment before finally speaking. "The people I worked for, the people I fought against, they don't forget." His voice was quieter now, but there was an edge to it, something dark. "And now that they know you exist, they'll come for you." Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Who?" Daniel took a turn, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "Men who don't care if you're innocent. They don't care if you know nothing about me. They just want leverage, and right now, you're it." Jake swallowed hard. "So what? Are we running?" Daniel shook his head. "No." His grip on the wheel tightened. "We're hunting." Before Jake could even process what that meant, headlights flashed in the mirror. A dark SUV turned onto the road behind them, moving fast. Too fast. Daniel's eyes sharpened. "Hold on." Jake barely had time to brace himself before Daniel yanked the wheel to the right. The car skidded off the road, straight into the darkness. The chase had begun. The tires screeched as Daniel spun the wheel, sending the SUV off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path. Trees blurred past them in the darkness, their shadows stretching like claws under the dim moonlight. Jake gripped the door handle, his heart slamming against his ribs. "What the hell is happening?" he shouted. Daniel's face remained unreadable, his hand steady on the wheel. "They found us faster than I expected." Jake turned, looking over his shoulder. The black SUV behind them wasn't just following. It was gaining. Headlights bounced over the uneven terrain, illuminating the dust cloud kicked up by their tires. A voice crackled over a hidden earpiece in Daniel's ear. "Target acquired. Permission to engage." Jake stiffened. "Who was that?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he reached under his seat, pulled out a sleek black handgun, and tossed it into Jake's lap. Jake's eyes widened. He stared at the weapon as if it might explode. "Are you insane?" "I don't know how to use this." Daniel's gaze flicked toward him for a split second, then learned fast. A sharp burst of gunfire shattered the night. Bullets ripped through the back windshield, glass exploding inward. Jake flinched, throwing his arms up as shards rained over them. Daniel cursed under his breath and yanked the wheel again. The SUV swerved violently, skimming the edge of a steep drop before straightening out. More shots rang out, cutting through the trees, kicking up dirt. Jake's breath came fast and shallow. His fingers clenched around the gun. "They're shooting at us." Daniel's voice was calm, almost bored. "That's what people with guns do." Jake spun back around, his hands shaking. He had never fired a gun in his life. He didn't even know if he could. But as the enemy SUV closed in, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just some scared kid anymore. He had been arrested, hunted, lied to his entire life. And now, someone wanted him dead for reasons he didn't even understand. Enough. Jake gritted his teeth, rolled down the window, and took a deep breath. His heart pounded as he lifted the gun with both hands. His fingers trembled against the trigger. He hesitated, just for a second, before squeezing it. Bang! The gun kicked back, nearly flying out of his grip. The shot went wide, disappearing into the trees. "Steady your hands," Daniel said without looking. "Exhale before you pull the trigger." Jake swallowed hard, adjusted his grip, and tried again. This time, the bullet struck the enemy vehicle's hood. Sparks flew. The SUV swerved slightly but kept coming. "Not bad," Daniel muttered, "but you'll need to do better." More gunfire erupted from behind. A bullet grazed the side mirror, shattering it instantly. Daniel's expression darkened. "That's enough." Without warning, he yanked the emergency brake. The SUV jerked sideways, spinning out on the dirt road. Jake's stomach flipped as he was thrown against the door. Tires screamed against the earth. The enemy vehicle tried to adjust, but it was too late. Daniel released the brake, slammed the gas, and reversed straight into them. The impact was brutal. Metal crunched. The front of the enemy SUV crumpled inward. Steam hissed from its damaged engine. It skidded to a violent stop, teetering on the edge of the ravine. Daniel didn't waste a second. He threw the car into park, flung open his door, and grabbed a second gun from his belt. "Stay here." Jake barely had time to breathe before Daniel was moving. Fast, too fast. He moved like a shadow, a blur of muscle and precision. The enemy SUV's door swung open, and a man stumbled out, coughing. His black tactical gear was smeared with dust and blood. He looked up, just in time to see Daniel's gun barrel aimed at his forehead. "Who sent you?" Daniel asked coldly. The man's hand twitched toward his holster. Bang! Daniel didn't hesitate. A single shot rang out. The man dropped instantly. Jake's breath hitched. He had never seen someone die before. His stomach twisted, but he couldn't look away. Daniel turned to the wrecked SUV. There was one more person inside, groaning, trying to crawl out. Jake saw something first. A grenade, loose on the dashboard, its pin barely hanging on. His throat tightened. "Dad." Daniel's eyes flicked to it in an instant. Without hesitation, he grabbed the second man by the collar and yanked him from the vehicle. Just as he did, boom! The explosion sent a wave of heat ripping through the trees. The force threw Jake backward inside their car. Smoke and fire erupted into the night sky. Daniel walked back toward the SUV, dragging the half-conscious man with him. He threw him onto the dirt, crouching beside him. "Tell me who sent you." The man groaned, blood trickling from his temple. He laughed weakly. "You already know." Daniel's eyes darkened. "Say it." The man coughed, then smirked. "Kingmaker says hello." Jake didn't understand, but he saw the way his father's jaw clenched, the way his fingers curled into fists. Daniel stood slowly, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he raised his gun and fired. The man's body went still. Jake's heart pounded. His father turned back to him, stepping into the faint glow of the fire. "Get in the car," Daniel said, his voice quieter now. Jake hesitated. His hands were still shaking. His mind was still trying to catch up to what he had just seen. But then he met Daniel's eyes. Cold, distant, but not unfeeling. Not heartless. And Jake realized something terrifying. His father wasn't just dangerous. He was legendary. The night stretched endlessly as they drove, the echoes of the explosion still ringing in Jake's ears. His hands were clammy, his breath uneven. Every time he blinked, he saw the man's body drop. the way his father had pulled the trigger without hesitation. Daniel drove in silence, his face carved from stone. The SUV's headlights cut through the darkness, but they felt like the only light left in the world. Jake swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Who is Kingmaker?" Daniel didn't answer right away. His fingers flexed against the wheel, a rare sign of tension. "A problem I was hoping you'd never have to deal with." Jake exhaled sharply. "Yeah, well, seems like I'm dealing with it now." Daniel glanced at him for a second, then nodded slightly, as if accepting the truth. "Kingmaker isn't a person," he said finally. "It's a network, a hidden force that controls things from the shadows. Governments, military operations, even entire wars. They don't start conflicts. They sell them." Jake frowned. "So there's some kind of secret organization." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "They don't have a name. No official records. No faces. Just a symbol. A chess piece." His voice darkened. "The king." Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. "And you, what? Took them down?" Daniel's silence spoke louder than words. Jake sat back, staring at the passing trees. "They want revenge," he muttered. "That's why they're after you." "No." Daniel's voice was calm, but firm. "They're after you." Jake turned sharply. "Me." Daniel exhaled, his grip on the wheel tightening. "I was a ghost, dead on paper. No attachments, no weaknesses." He glanced at Jake. "Then they found out about you." Jake's stomach twisted. "I don't even know you." Daniel's expression didn't change. "That doesn't matter to them." Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. His whole life, he had thought his father was just another soldier who died in service. Now he was learning that his father wasn't just alive. He was a target. And worse, so was he. The SUV suddenly slowed. Daniel pulled off the road, driving into a secluded area surrounded by thick trees. He killed the engine, then turned to Jake. "You need to understand something," Daniel said quietly. "From this moment on, your life is different. You don't get to go back to how things were. No more normal. No more safety." His voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it. "Regret. Guilt. If you stay with me, I can protect you. But if you run..." Jake scoffed. "Run where?" "They'll find me, won't they?" Daniel nodded. Silence fell between them. Jake clenched his fists. "Then why did you even come for me?" Daniel met his gaze. "Because you're my son." Jake swallowed, emotions tangling inside him. He had spent his whole life resenting a man he thought was dead. And now, that same man had just saved him. His father, a legend, a killer, a man who had walked into a police station like a shadow and walked out without a single mark. Jake didn't know if he could trust him, but he did know one thing. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted answers, he had no choice but to stay. Jake took a deep breath. "What do we do now?" Daniel looked out into the dark forest, his eyes scanning the distance. "Now." He reached into the back seat, pulling out a black duffel bag. He unzipped it, revealing a small arsenal of weapons, cash, and fake passports. He tossed one of the passports to Jake. "Now," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, "we prepare for war." "You said." Jake stared at the fake passport in his hands. The name on it wasn't his. The picture was, but the identity belonged to someone else. Someone who didn't exist. His chest tightened. His old life was gone. He looked up at Daniel. "So that's it. We just disappear." Daniel checked the ammunition in his pistol before sliding it back into his holster. "For now." Jake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And then what?" "We just keep running." Daniel's eyes locked onto his. "No. We finish this." Jake didn't know what scared him more, the way his father said it, or the way a part of him actually believed him. A low beep sounded from inside the SUV. Daniel reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a sleek black phone. A single message flashed on the screen. "We found him. Coordinates sent." Daniel's jaw tightened. He turned the phone toward Jake. "This is Kingmaker's lead strategist, the one who put the hit on you." Jake's pulse quickened. A name appeared below the message. Anton Beck. Daniel looked at his son. "If we take him out, we cut off the head of this operation before it spreads." Jake swallowed. "And if we don't?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Then they don't stop coming." Jake felt a rush of fear, but also something else. Determination. He had spent his life feeling powerless, lost. But now he had a chance to fight back. He nodded. "Let's go." Daniel's lips twitched, just slightly, a hint of approval. They climbed back into the SUV. Daniel started the engine, and the vehicle roared to life. As they pulled onto the road, Jake's grip tightened around the gun in his lap. He wasn't just running anymore. He was hunting. And for the first time in his life, he understood exactly who he was. His father's son.